She stepped off that stagecoach with one small trunk, a face that gave nothing away, and a pair of eyes that scanned the horizon like a woman who already knew someone was coming for her. Everett Cobb had asked for a practical woman, a quiet one, someone who'd work hard and not ask too many questions. What he got was something else entirely, a stranger who would turn his empty ranch into a battlefield, drag his buried grief back into the light, and force him to choose between the safe, numb life he'd built for himself and the one he never admitted he was still waiting for. Stay with me until the very end, because this story doesn't go where you think it's going. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and become part of our family. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The letter had taken 4 weeks to reach the agency in St. Louis, and another 2 weeks before a reply came back. A single folded page, plain paper, no perfume, no flourishes. Just a name. Francesca Windermere, age 28, available immediately. Everett had stared at that name for a long time, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee going untouched beside him. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Something more ordinary, maybe. A Mary or a Clara. A name that matched what he needed, which was not a love story, not a second beginning, not any of the soft things people like to pretend were waiting on the other side of loss. He needed someone who could keep accounts, patch a fence line if it came to it, and not fill the silence with noise he wasn't ready for. He sent the confirmation letter the same afternoon. The morning the stagecoach was due, Everett drove the wagon into Holt's Crossing without hurrying. The town wasn't much. A general store, a livery, a saloon that doubled as the post office on Tuesdays, and a church that needed a new roof more urgently than it needed a congregation. He knew everyone by name and owed most of them some form of quiet apology for being the kind of neighbor who never showed up unless he needed something. He parked outside the depot and sat there on the wagon bench, hat pulled low, watching the dust rise from the eastern road. Holt Briggs, who ran the general store and had opinions about everything, leaned against the doorframe across the street and called out, "She coming today?" "Appears so," Everett said. "You nervous?" "No?" Holt made a face that suggested he didn't believe that. Everett ignored him. The stagecoach arrived 22 minutes late, which was actually early by Holt's Crossing standards. It came in fast and loud, horses blowing hard, the driver hauling back on the reins with a string of language that made 2 women on the sidewalk gather their children and move along. The door swung open before the wheels had fully stopped. The first person out was a heavy-set man in a merchant's coat, clutching a leather satchel to his chest like someone might steal it. He looked around once, dismissed everything he saw, and walked directly toward the saloon. The second person was Francesca Windermere. She didn't rush. That was the first thing Everett noticed. She descended the step carefully, steadied herself on the doorframe for just a moment. The coach had clearly been a rough ride. And then she straightened up and looked at the town. Not at Everett. At the town. She turned her head slowly, east to west, taking in the buildings, the people watching her, the mountains sitting low and blue in the distance. It was the way a person looked at a place when they were deciding something about it, not just passing through, assessing. She was dressed simply, dark blue traveling dress, practical boots, her dark hair pinned up without fuss under a hat that had seen better days. She carried a small leather bag over one shoulder and she held it. Everett noticed this later, turning it over in his mind. Not by the strap, but with her hand wrapped around the body of the bag itself. Closer. Like something in it mattered. He climbed down from the wagon and walked over. "Miss Windermere." She turned and looked at him directly. No shy drop of the eyes, no nervous smile. Just a clear, steady look that lasted about 2 seconds longer than he was comfortable with. "Mr. Cobb," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected. Calm. The kind of calm that sometimes meant nothing, and sometimes meant someone had worked very hard to build it. "Wagon's over here," he said. "Your trunk?" "That's the one." She nodded toward the single battered trunk the driver was already pulling from the back. Small. Everything she owned, apparently, fit into something a grown man could carry one-handed. Everett loaded it himself, and she climbed up to the bench without waiting to be helped. He stood there for a moment, one hand on the side of the wagon, then walked around and climbed up the other side. They rolled out of Holt's Crossing without another word. The road back to the ranch was 2 hours of hard-packed dirt through scrub and open grassland. Everett usually didn't mind the ride. It gave him time to think, or sometimes to not think, which he preferred. But sitting beside a stranger who said nothing and yet somehow seemed to be paying attention to everything made the silence feel different, occupied. After about 20 minutes, she said, "How many acres?" 460. Cattle? 63 head right now, down from 90 last year. She didn't ask why, she just nodded slightly, like she was filing the number away. "You know cattle?" he asked. "Not particularly, but I know what it means when a number goes the wrong direction." He glanced at her. She was watching the horizon again, that same steady scan. Her eyes moved to a cluster of rocks off the north side of the road, stayed there for a half second, then moved on. Everett thought about it later and couldn't decide if he'd imagined it. "The letter said you were from Philadelphia," he said. "Originally. Long way to come." "Yes," she agreed. He waited to see if she'd say more. She didn't. "Most women who write to the agency," he started slowly, "they're usually looking to—" He stopped, not entirely sure how to finish that sentence without it sounding like an accusation. "To escape something?" she said. "I was going to say settle somewhere." "Most of them probably mean both." He couldn't argue with that. They rode another mile in silence. Then she surprised him. "What was her name?" she asked. He kept his eyes on the road. "Whose name?" "Your wife." The word landed quietly, the way a stone drops into still water. He felt the ripple of it, but kept his face still. "Ruth," he said after a moment. "How long ago?" 6 years. She didn't say "I'm sorry," or "that must have been hard," or any of the other things people said when they wanted to close a door they'd just opened. She just said, "All right," and went back to watching the road. Everett realized somewhere around mile 12 that he hadn't thought about what it would feel like to say Ruth's name out loud to a stranger. He'd expected it to feel like something being pulled. Instead, it just felt like a fact. He wasn't sure what to do with that. Well, the ranch house came into view around a bend, a low wooden structure, solid but weathered, the barn behind it twice as large as the house itself, which said something about Everett's priorities. A dog of indeterminate breed came loping out to meet the wagon, barking once and then losing interest. Francesca looked at the house for a moment without speaking. "It's not much," Everett said. "It's standing," she replied. "That's more than some." He helped her down from the wagon this time, and she let him, though she didn't look like she needed it. He showed her inside, the main room, the kitchen, the small bedroom off the back hallway that he'd cleared out the week before, changing the linens twice because the first time hadn't felt right, and he didn't want to examine why. She walked through each room slowly, ran a hand along the kitchen counter, checked the window latch on the back wall, opened the pantry, and looked inside. "When did you last organize this?" she asked. "Define organize." She turned and looked at him with an expression that was not quite amusement but lived in that neighborhood. "I'll take that as a never." "I knew where everything was." "You knew where you'd put everything. That's not the same thing." He didn't have an answer for that because she wasn't wrong. He left her to settle in, walking back out to unhitch the horses and put the wagon away. He stood in the barn for a while with his hand on the horse's neck, not doing much of anything, just standing there. She wasn't what he'd expected. He'd expected someone who would step into the shape he'd already decided on, quiet, useful, grateful to have a place. Instead, he had a woman who asked direct questions, watched the road like she was calculating something, and had a way of looking at him that made him feel like he was being read. He told himself it didn't matter. She was here to work. He was here to provide a household. That was the agreement. He almost believed it. The next 3 days passed in a careful kind of order. Francesca woke before dawn each morning. He could hear her moving in the kitchen before the sky turned gray, and by the time he came in from the first round of morning chores, there was coffee made, and whatever came out of the pantry had been turned into something that actually resembled a meal. She didn't hover, didn't trail after him asking what needed to be done or where things were kept. She found things herself, fixed things herself, and when she didn't know something, she watched until she did. On the third afternoon, he came back from the south fence to find her sitting at his desk, the account ledger open in front of her. He stopped in the doorway. "Those are private," he said. She looked up. "They're also wrong." He stepped inside. "Excuse me? 2 entries in March. You've double recorded the feed payment. And here," she pointed to a column near the bottom of the page, "you've got the timber sale listed under costs instead of income. It's not a large error, but over time these add up." She paused. "You've been operating under the impression that this ranch is doing worse than it is." He crossed the room and looked over her shoulder at the page. She was right. He could see it immediately, now that she'd pointed at it, and he felt a dull heat rise in the back of his neck. "I would have found it," he said. "I'm sure you would have." Something in her tone said she wasn't sure of that at all, but she didn't press it. She closed the ledger and set it aside. "I'm not trying to take over your house, Mr. Cobb," she said. "I'm trying to be useful. That's why I came." He looked at her. There was something in those last 3 words, "that's why I came," that felt like the edge of something larger, like a sentence that had more to it, cut off before it reached the part that mattered. "All right," he said. She nodded and stood up. "I noticed the water channel on the east side is running slow. Looks like there's a blockage about 40 yards up from the trough. I can help clear it tomorrow if you want to get to it early." He blinked. "You spotted that already?" "I walked the property yesterday afternoon." "All of it?" "Most of it." She moved toward the kitchen. "Coffee's still warm if you want it." It was on the 4th night that Everett saw it. He'd been up past midnight with one of the mares who was running a low fever, checking on her every hour, and he'd come back into the house quiet, not wanting to wake anyone. The front room was dark, the hallway dim. He was passing Francesca's door when he noticed the light, thin, yellow, flickering under the crack in the door. A candle, still burning at this hour. He almost kept walking. It wasn't his business. But then he heard the sound, a soft, barely there sound. Not crying. Not exactly. More like the controlled breath of someone holding something in, someone who'd had a lot of practice not making noise while they felt whatever they were feeling. He stood there in the dark hallway for a moment. He walked on. Back in his own room, he sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall for a while. He'd told himself she was a practical woman, and he was a practical man, and this was a practical arrangement. That was still true, as far as it went, but a practical woman running from a practical reason didn't breathe like that in the dark. He didn't sleep much that night, and in the morning, when she came out to the kitchen looking perfectly composed, not a trace of whatever the previous night had been anywhere on her face, he said nothing. He just poured her coffee and handed her the cup. She looked at him with those steady eyes. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it," he said, and neither of them did. It was 5 days after her arrival when the letter came. Everett had ridden to town for supplies and stopped at the post office, which was really just a corner of the saloon with a mail slot and a lockbox, and found the usual assortment of catalogs and one statement from the bank, and tucked under all of it, a heavy envelope. Good paper. Dark red wax seal, embossed with something he couldn't quite make out, addressed to Miss F. Windermere, care of the Holtz Crossing Post Office. He didn't open it. He had no right to. He set it on the seat beside him and drove home. He came in through the back door, set the supply sacks on the counter, and held out the envelope. Francesca was at the stove, stirring something. She turned, and the moment her eyes landed on the envelope, everything changed. It was fast, a flicker, a fraction of a second. But he was watching, and he saw it. Her face didn't crumble or go pale. It went still, completely, unnaturally still, the way a surface goes still when something cold moves through it from underneath. Then she crossed the room, took the envelope from his hand, and slid it into her apron pocket. "Thank you," she said, her voice level. "Francesca." She had turned back to the stove. At his use of her name, she stopped, but didn't turn around. "Who knows you're here?" he asked. A long pause. Long enough that he started to think she wasn't going to answer. "I don't know," she said. "I hoped no one." She picked up the spoon again. "I was apparently wrong." He stood there, watching the back of her head, and understood with a certainty that settled into his chest like a stone. Whatever this woman had come here running from, it had just found her address. She didn't open the letter that night. Everett knew because he was awake for most of it, lying on his back in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house settle around him. The wind had picked up around 10 o'clock, pushing against the eaves, rattling the loose shutter on the south wall he'd been meaning to fix for 2 months. Normal sounds, known sounds. But underneath all of it, he kept hearing the thing he hadn't heard. No rustle of paper, no creak of her floorboards, nothing that suggested she'd done anything with that envelope except put it somewhere and sit with it unopened. He understood that. There were things in life you could hold for a while before you had to face them. He'd done it himself, after Ruth. Letters from her mother, from the bank, from the county office. They'd sat in a drawer for weeks while he figured out how to breathe again. He finally slept somewhere past 2 in the morning and woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of rain. Francesca was already in the kitchen. She'd made biscuits from scratch, which she hadn't done before, and she was standing at the window with her back to him, watching the rain fall on the yard. She had the kind of stillness that morning had put on her that didn't come from rest. It came from a decision already made somewhere in the hours before dawn. He didn't ask. He poured his coffee, sat down at the table, and ate. She turned around eventually, sat across from him with her own cup, and said, "I need to tell you something." He set down his biscuit. "All right." She looked at the table for a moment, not avoiding his eyes so much as organizing herself. He'd noticed that about her. She didn't speak until she knew what she was going to say. It had irritated him at first. Now he recognized it for what it was. A habit built out of necessity, not arrogance. "My father's name is Whitmore Windermere," she said. "He owns shipping lines out of Philadelphia, 3 of them. He has money enough to make problems go away and lawyers enough to make it look clean." She paused. "He arranged a marriage for me 2 years ago. A business arrangement. A merger, really, dressed up in wedding clothes. The man's name doesn't matter. What matters is I had no part in choosing it." Everett said nothing. He just listened. "I tried to refuse twice. The first time he convinced me it was for the family, for my brother's futures, for the stability of everything we had. I let myself be convinced." Her jaw tightened slightly. "The second time, I had evidence that the man he'd chosen had a history of cruelty. I brought it to my father. He told me I was being dramatic, that women of good standing didn't involve themselves in rumor." She looked up then. "So I left." "How?" "Carefully. Over several months. I moved small amounts of money when I could. I arranged the agency through a contact who owed me a favor. I took what I could carry, and I didn't say goodbye." A thin pause. "I knew if I said goodbye, he'd find a way to stop me before I made it to the door." Everett turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady, even fall, the kind that would last most of the day. "The letter," he said. "I haven't opened it yet." "You don't need to open it to know what it says." She looked at him steadily. "No," she agreed. "I don't." He sat with that for a moment. "How much time do you think we have?" The question seemed to catch her off guard, not the content of it, but the we. He saw it register in her eyes, a small shift, something cautious moving across her face. "I don't know," she said. "He has people, investigators, men who find things for him. If the letter has already reached here..." She stopped, started again. "The agency knows where I came. If someone approached them with enough money or enough pressure, they would know my destination. Would they give it up?" "My father is very persuasive." Everett nodded slowly. He pushed back from the table, stood up, and walked to the window. The yard was a sheet of soft gray rain. The barn door was holding, the latch doing its job. He stood there looking out at his land, at the fence lines, the muddy track, the old oak that had been there longer than the house, and thought about what it had cost him to build this particular kind of quiet. The years he'd spent turning grief into routine, loneliness into structure, an empty house into something that functioned even if it didn't feel like much. He'd asked for a practical woman. He turned back around. "Open the letter," he said. She looked at him. "You've been carrying it long enough," he said. "Open it." "No, She opened it at the kitchen table while he stayed at the window, giving her what distance the small room allowed. He heard the sound of the seal breaking, the slow unfold of heavy paper. Then silence. A long silence. "He knows I'm in the territory," she said, her voice flat. "Does he know the town?" "Not yet. Or if he does, he doesn't say it here." She paused. "He says I have 30 days to return of my own choice. After that, he'll exercise his legal authority as my father to ensure my return." Another pause, longer. "He says the arrangement still stands. The man is still willing." Everett turned around. She was sitting with the letter held in both hands, reading it again, and her face was doing that closed thing it did when she was feeling something she'd decided not to show. But her hands were not as steady as the rest of her. "He can't force you back," Everett said. "You're a married woman." She set the letter down. "We signed papers at the agency, Mr. Cobb. We've been on the same property for less than a week. My father's lawyers would argue the marriage was coerced or fraudulent without difficulty." "Would they be right?" She met his eyes. "Not about the coercion." "Then we give them nothing to argue about." She looked at him for a long moment. "You don't have to do this. I'm aware. You asked for a quiet life. I am not—" She gestured vaguely at herself. "This is not a quiet situation." "No," he agreed. "It's not." "Then why—" "Because you're here," he said simply, "and this is my house, and I don't hand people over to men who treat them like property." The words came out harder than he intended. Not at her, just out. He turned back to the window because he wasn't sure what his face was doing, and he didn't particularly want her to see it. Behind him, she was quiet for a long time. "All right," she said finally. "Then we should talk about what to do." What they decided, practically speaking, was not much different from what they were already doing. They would continue working the ranch. They would not draw attention in town. If anyone came asking, a stranger, someone who didn't belong, Everett would handle it. What changed was something underneath that, the way they moved through the same spaces, the way information started passing between them that hadn't before. She told him about the water channel blockage, and he told her about the fence line on the northwest quarter that he'd been avoiding because it ran along the boundary of a property dispute he'd had with his neighbor Gideon Marsh for going on 3 years. She reorganized the pantry, fully, systematically, labeling things in her small, precise handwriting. And he didn't say a word about it, just quietly started putting things back where she'd put them instead of where he used to keep them. She learned that the dog's name was Walker, that he was 8 years old, and that Everett had owned him so long that he'd stopped noticing him the way you stop noticing your own breathing. She started feeding Walker scraps, and the dog switched his nighttime sleeping position from Everett's doorway to just outside hers, which Everett noticed and chose not to mention. He learned that she woke in the night sometimes, not often, not dramatically, just a light sleeper who occasionally moved through the house in the dark hours. He stopped being startled by the sound of it. He started, without making any decision about it, leaving the lamp oil filled in case she needed the light. The work helped. It always did. There was too much of it on a working ranch to leave room for much else. The cattle needed moving to new grazing. The water channel needed clearing. The account ledger needed finishing now that Francesca had found the errors, and they'd spent 2 evenings at the kitchen table going through every entry together, her pointing and him correcting, neither of them commenting on the fact that this was the longest stretch of time Everett had spent in close company with another person in years. He wasn't good at it. He said the wrong thing sometimes, or nothing when something should have been said. He had habits built from 6 years of living alone that weren't designed for company. He forgot to say when he'd be back from the south pasture, came in late without word, left his boots in places they blocked the kitchen path. She didn't make a production of any of it. She just moved the boots, once, and gave him a single look, and he started leaving them by the door after that. It was the end of the second week when she found the room. She wasn't snooping. He knew that. She'd been looking for a length of rope she'd seen hanging near the back of the house, and the door was in the hallway between the main room and the back porch, a door that stayed closed so consistently she might have assumed it was a closet or a storage space. But the latch was old and had a tendency to drift if not fully seated, and it had drifted that afternoon. He came in from the barn to find her standing in the hallway, still, the open door in front of her, looking in. "Francesca," he said. She startled, genuinely startled, which he'd never seen her do before, and turned around. "I'm sorry. The door was open and It's all right." He walked toward her, looked past her into the room. It was dim, the curtain drawn. Ruth's sewing table was still in the corner. The chair she'd always sat in turned slightly toward the window the way she used to turn it. A small watercolor of a creek, badly framed, slightly crooked, that Ruth had painted herself the summer before she got sick. Boxes he'd never opened stacked against the far wall. He reached past Francesca and pulled the door shut. She watched him. He could feel it without looking. "I'm sorry," she said again, quietly. "I said it's all right." "How long has that door been closed?" He started to say since she passed and then didn't, because that would have been 6 years ago, and even he could hear how that sounded. "A while," he said. She didn't push. That was the thing about Francesca. She knew when not to push. She waited, and sometimes the waiting was enough. He stood there with his hand still on the door, not going anywhere. "She painted that watercolor," he said. "It's bad, objectively. The perspective is wrong, but she was proud of it." He paused. "I told her it was good." "Was that a lie?" "It was a kindness." Sometimes those are the same. He looked at her then. She wasn't offering sympathy exactly. It wasn't that soft, what she was giving him. It was something more level, just acknowledgement. "That happened. That was real. You can say it." "She died of fever," he said. "February. Coldest month I can remember, and she burned up from the inside anyway." He stopped. "I was with her. I didn't leave the room for 3 days." Francesca said nothing. "Afterward," he said, "I just closed the door. I kept telling myself I'd deal with it eventually, sort through things, decide what to keep." He looked at the door. "Apparently, eventually takes a while." "It takes as long as it takes," she said. He let go of the door, looked down at his hands. "You were looking for rope?" The shift back was deliberate, and she accepted it. "There's a section of the south fence that's down. I thought I could start on it before it rained again. I'll do it." "I know how to fix a fence." He looked at her. "I know you do. I'm just saying, I'll do it." A pause. "Together would go faster," she said. He almost said no. Old habit. The long-built reflex of a man who'd learned to carry things alone because there was no one left to share the weight. "Yeah," he said instead. "All right, sound." They fixed the fence in the late afternoon, working in the kind of side-by-side quiet that's different from the kind that comes from having nothing to say. She had seen how he did things and had adjusted accordingly, handing him the wire before he asked for it, holding the post steady while he worked the driver, moving efficiently and without needing to be directed. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking. The way she worked, the competence of it. She told him she knew nothing about cattle, and that was likely true, but she hadn't grown up helpless either. Someone had taught her things, or she'd learned them herself out of necessity, and he wondered which it was and didn't ask. On the drive back, the wagon bouncing slowly over the rutted track in the fading light, she said, "My mother taught me to ride before I was 6. She used to say that a woman who can't move under her own power is a woman at someone else's mercy." He glanced at her. "Your mother sounds sharp." "She was." Past tense, delivered without drama. "She died when I was 14. "I'm sorry." "She would have hated what my father became after she was gone," Francesca said. "He wasn't always like this. Or maybe he was and she just softened it, made it livable." She was quiet for a moment. Without her, there was nothing to push back against him. "Until you." She looked at him sideways. "Until me. And look how well that went." He felt something pull at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but in that direction. She noticed it, and something shifted in her face too, brief and real. They drove the rest of the way home in the same quiet, and it was a different quiet than it had been 2 weeks ago. Still careful, still new, but easier around the edges, the way a pair of boots gets easier after you've walked some miles in them. It was 17 days after Francesca arrived that the stranger came. Everett was in the barn when Walker started barking. the sharp, sustained bark he only used for people he didn't know. Everett set down what he was doing and came to the barn door. A horse he didn't recognize was tied to the post outside. A good horse. Too good for the road. Too clean to have traveled hard country. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at the horse and felt something cold and specific settle in his chest. He walked to the house. The stranger was already on the porch. He was maybe 45, dressed in a dark coat that cost more than anything Everett owned, with the kind of face that practiced pleasantness as a professional habit. Not handsome, not ugly, carefully arranged. His hands were relaxed at his sides, nothing threatening in his posture. Just a man paying a friendly call. "Mr. Cobb?" he said. "Who's asking?" A smooth smile. "My name is Silas Vane. I represent certain interests out of Philadelphia." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm looking for a woman. She may have come through this area recently. Dark hair, traveling alone." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small photograph, the kind taken in a studio, formal and stiff. "Perhaps you've seen her?" Everett looked at the photograph. Francesca, younger, in a dress she'd never choose for herself, her expression carefully blank the way people looked in photographs when someone told them to hold still and be pleasant. He looked at it for exactly long enough. Then he looked up. "Can't say that I have," he said. Silas Vane held his gaze for a moment, reading him the way a man reads a poker hand. Then the professional smile came back. "She may have used a different name," Vane said. "She's a troubled young woman. Her family is concerned." "Troubled how?" "She has a tendency to make impulsive decisions. Her father worries." "I imagine he does," Everett said. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "I haven't seen anyone matching that description. Last strangers through here were headed west. Could be she was among them." Vane studied him. "You didn't look at that photograph very long." "I looked long enough to know I haven't seen her." Another pause. Vane tucked the photograph back into his pocket, slow and deliberate. "If she does come through," he said pleasantly, "there's a reward, $50, for information leading to her safe return to her family." Everett let that land and then said nothing. Vane took a step back, looked out at the property with the casual appraisal of a man used to cataloging things. "Nice spread," he said. "It does the job. Isolated out here. That's the appeal." Vane smiled again. This one just slightly different from the others, the professional coating a little thinner. "Of course. Well, good day, Mr. Cobb." He walked off the porch, unhitched his horse with practiced ease, and rode back out the way he'd come without looking back. Everett stood in the doorway and watched him until the dust settled. He went inside. Francesca was standing at the far end of the kitchen, her back against the wall, her arms folded, the small leather bag held against her side the way she held it when she was afraid. She had heard everything through the thin wall. He could see it in her face, the tight, controlled look of someone who had just heard their worst fear knocked politely at a door and then ride away. "He'll come back," she said. "Maybe," Everett said. "He's not done." "No, he's not." Everett crossed the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, drank half of it. "But he came looking for a woman traveling alone. What he found was a rancher who hasn't seen anyone like that." He set the glass down. "So right now, all he has is a conversation that went nowhere." She was watching him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Something between gratitude and something sharper. Something that looked almost like disbelief. "You didn't hesitate," she said. "No." "Why?" He thought about it honestly. "Because you're here," he said again. Same answer as before. Still true. "And I don't like men who dress up a hunt as concern." She stood there for a moment, the leather bag still held close, her breathing slowly evening out. Then something in her posture shifted. A fraction, subtle, the very slight loosening of a person who has been rigid for a very long time. "He'll go to town," she said. "He'll ask questions." "Let him. This town doesn't give much to strangers." He picked up his glass again. "Holt Briggs talks too much about the wrong things and not enough about anything useful. It's worked in my favor before." She almost laughed. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was in the same territory. An exhale with something real in it, brief and unguarded, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. She set the bag down on the counter. She'd never done that before. Set it down and left it somewhere, within reach but not in hand. He noticed and said nothing. Outside, the afternoon was going gold, long shadows stretching from the fence posts across the yard. Walker had stopped barking and was lying near the barn door again, already done with the alarm, already back to the ordinary business of the afternoon. Francesca moved to the counter and started on supper, and Everett sat down at the table, and neither of them said anything more about Silas Vane or the photograph or the $50, because there was nothing more to say about it right now, and they both understood that some things you set aside until you need to pick them back up. But when she set a plate in front of him 40 minutes later, and their eyes met briefly across the table, something had changed. He couldn't have named it with precision, just the particular quality of the silence between them, something that had been stretched thin with wariness for 17 days, had shifted into something that held a little differently. Not safe. It wasn't that. Silas Vane was going to come back, or someone like him was, and they both knew it. But not alone. That was the difference. For the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, Everett Cobb did not sit down to supper alone. Silas Vane did go into town. Everett had known he would. He found out from Holt Briggs, who rode out 2 days later under the pretense of returning a borrowed hand tool and spent the first 10 minutes talking about the weather before getting to the point, which was what Holt always did when he had information he was bursting to deliver but wanted to appear casual about. "Fella came through day before yesterday," Holt said, leaning against the porch railing with his thumbs in his suspenders. "Well dressed. Philadelphia manners, you could tell just by looking. Asking around about a woman." He paused to let that settle. "Dark hair, traveling alone. Might have been using a different name." Everett was sitting on the porch steps, turning a piece of wood over in his hands. He said nothing. "I told him I hadn't seen anyone like that," Holt said. He said it plainly, without decoration, and looked at Everett with the directness of a man who had known him a long time and was choosing his words carefully. A couple others said the same. Martha Gale said she recalled a woman coming through on the westbound stage maybe 3 weeks back, headed toward Connolly Fork. "That's so," Everett said. "That's what she said." A pause. "Martha Gale's got a long memory for women who've had to run from something. Her own mother did it, back in '58. Holt cleared his throat. "Anyway, just thought you ought to know." He left shortly after, taking the borrowed tool with him and not asking a single question about the woman currently visible through the kitchen window, moving back and forth between the stove and the counter with the steady efficiency of someone who had been there longer than 3 weeks. Everett sat on the steps a while longer after Holt's wagon disappeared down the road. He thought about Martha Gale, a woman he'd never particularly warmed to, pointing a well-dressed stranger from Philadelphia toward the wrong compass direction. He thought about small towns and the way they kept their own business and other people's business in entirely separate categories, and how 6 years of being a solitary, reasonably honest neighbor had apparently counted for something. He went inside and told Francesca what Holt had said. She listened with her hands still, which was how she listened to things that mattered. "Connolly Fork is 2 days west," she said. "Yep. He'll follow it. For a while. When it doesn't pan out, he'll circle back." Everett pulled out a chair and sat at the kitchen table. "But that buys us time." She turned back to the stove. "Time to do what exactly?" It was a fair question, and he didn't have a clean answer for it, so he didn't offer one. Instead, he said, "Is there anyone in Philadelphia who knew your plans before you left?" She was quiet for a moment. "One person. A woman named Delia Marsh. No relation to your neighbor, different family entirely. She helped me contact the agency. She's trustworthy." "Could your father have gotten to her?" "He could try. She's not easily gotten to." Something crossed her face, a complicated expression that carried the weight of a friendship that had cost something. "But I've been careful not to send word to her since I arrived. I didn't want to create a trail." "Smart." "Lonely," she said quietly, almost to herself. Then she straightened up and the moment passed. "What about the legal question? You mentioned before that our marriage, the circumstances of it, could be argued. I said your father's lawyers would try to argue it. Could they succeed?" He thought about it honestly. "Depends on the judge and the county. Out here, a signed contract and a witnessed ceremony carries weight. Nobody's going to let a Philadelphia lawyer wave a piece of paper and override a legal marriage just because the father doesn't like the groom. He paused. But a judge in the right pocket is a different matter. My father has a talent for finding the right pockets. Then we make the marriage harder to argue. He met her eyes across the room. Which means we can't keep living like two people sharing a house out of practical necessity. She held his gaze. No, she said after a moment. I suppose we can't. Neither of them said anything more about it that evening, but something had been named, and named things have a way of taking up more space than unnamed ones. The days that followed had a different quality, not easier exactly. The threat of Vane's return sat low and constant in the background, and Francesca still woke in the night sometimes, and Everett still left too many silences where words should have gone. But there was a kind of purposefulness to the time they spent together now. A direction. She rode with him on the cattle check 3 mornings running. She wasn't a natural rider the way someone raised on horseback was, but she was competent and she didn't pretend otherwise, which he respected. On the 3rd morning, she lost a stirrup crossing a shallow creek and grabbed the saddle horn and swore, briefly and with feeling, in a way that made Everett pull his horse up and look at her. You all right? Fine, she said, jaw set. I lost the stirrup. I saw. It won't happen again. He didn't smile, but something in his chest loosened a little. They rode back at a walk, the cattle settled in the north pasture, the late morning going warm around them. She was quiet, watching the land the way she'd watched it from the stagecoach. That same scanning attention, always taking stock. Do you like it? He asked. She glanced at him. The riding? The land. She looked out across the grass, the low hills, the sky that out here was so wide it sometimes felt more like an ocean than a sky. She took her time answering. It's nothing like Philadelphia, she said. There's no softness to it. It doesn't ask for your approval. Is that a yes or a no? It's a yes, she said. I think I like things that don't ask for my approval. He thought about that. Thought about her arriving on that stagecoach, scanning the horizon, holding her bag close. A woman who had spent years in a world that required her approval to be decorative and her disapproval to be silent, and had finally walked away from all of it. You could build something here, he said. She looked at him. He stopped, started again, more carefully. I'm not trying to make promises I can't keep. Things are still uncertain. With Vane, with your father, but this land doesn't care about any of that. The work is real regardless. I know, she said. I've noticed. I just mean you're not a visitor here. It came out more plainly than he'd planned, with less smoothness than the moment deserved, and he felt the familiar heat of a man who doesn't talk much suddenly saying something that mattered. But she didn't look away. Thank you, she said, and it was the most weight he'd ever heard her put in 2 words. It was the following Tuesday when Silas Vane came back. Everett saw him from the south field, a dark figure on the road, that same expensive horse moving at a deliberate pace that said this wasn't a man passing through. He was coming with purpose this time. The casual detour to Connolly Fork hadn't worked, and now he was done being casual. Everett left the fence he'd been working and got back to the house before Vane reached the yard. He came in through the back, found Francesca at the desk with the account ledger, and said, He's coming up the road. She looked up. He watched her face do the thing it did. Go still, go inward, build up the composure she needed. And then she stood and closed the ledger. What do you need me to do? She asked. He thought fast. Go to the back room. Not the closed one, the washroom. Stay there and don't come out until I come for you. I'm not going to hide in a washroom, Everett. It was the first time she'd used his first name without being prompted. Neither of them acknowledged it, but it was there. I'm not asking you to hide, he said. I'm asking you to stay out of his line of sight until I know what he's come with this time. Last visit was a question. This one will be something different. He met her eyes. Let me find out what we're dealing with before he sees you. She held the look for a moment, the push and pull of a woman who did not take naturally to being managed, even sensibly. Then she nodded, once. All right, but if you need me, I'm 15 feet away. I know. She went. He waited 2 counts, then walked out to the porch. Vane was already at the gate. He dismounted smoothly, tied his horse without hurry, and walked toward the house with the measured pace of a man who had decided something and was comfortable with the decision. Up close, in the afternoon light, Everett could see that the professional pleasantness had thinned. The suit was the same quality. The smile was the same shape, but the eyes behind it were working harder. "Mr. Cobb," he said. "Vane." Something flickered in the man's expression at the use of his bare last name. No courtesy. He let it go. "I found that the information you gave me last visit didn't quite hold up," he said. "The woman hadn't come through Connolly Fork." "Is that right?" Nobody there had seen her either. He stopped at the base of the porch steps, one hand resting on the post. "Now, I've been in this business long enough to know when a trail goes cold because the person isn't there, and when it goes cold because the people I'm talking to have decided they don't feel like talking." He looked up at Everett pleasantly. "You understand?" "I understand what you're saying. Then I'll be straightforward with you." He reached into his coat. Everett watched the hand carefully, but what it produced was a folded document, not anything worse. "I have papers here signed by Whitmore Windermere, establishing legal guardianship authority over his daughter Francesca Windermere, currently unmarried to any recognized—" "She's my wife," Everett said. The words landed flat and clean in the afternoon air. Vane went still for just a half second, enough to show the information had hit something, and then recovered smoothly. "Mr. Cobb," he said, with measured patience, "a mail order arrangement conducted at a distance, signed under circumstances that may have involved misrepresentation, is not what most courts would consider a binding. We were married by a county registrar," Everett said, "witnessed by 2 residents of Holt's Crossing. The paperwork is filed." He let that stand for a moment. "You're welcome to check it." Vane looked at him, looked at the house, looked back at Everett. "May I speak with her?" he asked. Directly. "No." "Mr. Cobb, I'm not here to cause trouble." "You're here to take my wife back to a man who wants to sell her into a marriage she refused twice," Everett said, keeping his voice level. "That's trouble by definition. I don't care how you dress it." Vane's pleasant expression finally cracked, just slightly, just at the edges. He folded the document and put it back in his coat. "Mr. Windermere is a patient man," he said, "but his patience has limits." "So does mine," Everett said. "You've reached them." A long pause. A horse somewhere in the distance, the sound of a crow overhead. Vane looked at the house one more time, a slow, taking inventory kind of look that Everett didn't like. "I'll be in the territory a while longer," Vane said. "That's your business." He tipped his hat, an absurdly formal gesture under the circumstances, turned around, untied his horse, and rode back down the road. Everett stood on the porch until the dust settled. Then he stood there a little longer, working through what he'd just said, what he'd committed to, what it meant in practical terms. He was a man who didn't speak carelessly. He knew that, which meant he had not spoken carelessly just now. He went inside. Francesca was not in the washroom. She was standing in the hallway, arms folded, and from the look on her face she had heard every word through the thin wall, same as she'd heard Vane's first visit. He stopped when he saw her. "You didn't have to say that," she said. Her voice was careful, working to stay level. "I know. You called me your wife, to a man who'll report everything back to my father." "I know that too." She stared at him. "Everett, do you understand what you just did? That's not— You can't take that back. If Vane goes back to Philadelphia and tells my father that his daughter has a husband who intends to keep her, my father won't just send a letter next time. He'll— "I know what he'll do," Everett said. "I've been thinking about it." "And?" He looked at her. "And I said what I said." She pulled in a breath, let it out slowly. "You are the most stubborn man I have ever met." "Probably." "I came here to keep you out of this," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word, the first time he'd heard anything like that from her, and she looked briefly furious at herself for it. "I came here so that whoever I involved wouldn't become a target, a problem." "Francesca." "What?" "You can't protect everyone from the consequences of caring about you," he said. "Some of us are going to do it anyway." She looked at him for a long time. Something moved through her face that she didn't quite manage to put back where it came from. Then she turned away, which was the only privacy the small hallway allowed, and he gave it to her by walking to the kitchen and finding something to do with his hands. That night, for the first time, they sat on the porch together after supper. Not by arrangement, it just happened. She came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one, and he moved over on the steps to make room, and they sat there in the dark watching the stars come out over the flat land. Walker settled between them. A coyote called from somewhere north of the creek, answered by another one further away. "Tell me about Ruth," she said. He wasn't startled by it. Somewhere in the last few weeks, he'd stopped being startled by the things Francesca asked. "What do you want to know?" "Whatever you want to tell." He thought about it. "She was stubborn," he said. "More stubborn than me, which is saying something. She had opinions about everything, and she delivered them like the matter was settled before you'd even had a chance to respond." He paused. "We fought. Regularly. About nothing important, mostly. Where to plant the kitchen garden. Whether the barn needed a new coat of paint. She was almost always right, which made the fighting worse." Francesca said nothing, just listened. "She wanted children," he said. "We'd been trying for 2 years when she got sick. I used to think, for a while after, I used to think about that. The timing of things." He stopped. "It seemed cruel." "It was cruel," she said simply. "Yes." He looked at his coffee cup. "I was angry for a long time. At everything. The land, the weather, the doctor who couldn't do anything. At Ruth, a little, which I know doesn't make sense. It makes complete sense. I wasn't a good person to be around for about 2 years. I imagine not. Then I just got numb. And numb was easier, so I stayed there." He looked out at the dark. The agency letter was the first thing I'd done in 6 years that wasn't just maintenance, just keeping the basic operations going. He paused. "I told myself it was practical. A hired hand would have cost more." "Was that true?" "Partly." He looked at her. "Partly I was just tired of the quiet." She turned her head and met his eyes. In the dark, with the stars doing what they did out here where there was no town light to compete with them, her face had lost some of its guardedness. She looked younger, or maybe just more like herself. "I'm glad you weren't entirely practical about it," she said. "You've changed things here," he said. "I want you to know I see that. Not just the ledger. Not just the water channel and the pantry. Just, the house feels different." She looked away, back at the stars. "Different how?" "Inhabited," he said. "It feels inhabited again." She was quiet for a long moment. Walker shifted between them, let out a long sigh, and settled again. Somewhere out on the flat land, the coyotes had stopped calling. "I never wanted to be someone's rescue story," she said finally. "The woman saved from her terrible father by a good man. I've spent 2 years fighting not to be a story other people told about me." "I know," he said. "But I also—" She stopped, tried again. "I haven't had anyone stand between me and my father since my mother was alive. I'd forgotten what it felt like." She looked down at her coffee cup. It felt like something. He didn't say anything because she wasn't done. "I'm not asking you to save me," she said quietly. "I want to be clear about that. I'm capable of handling my own. I know you are." "Then why did you—" "Because I wanted to," he said. "Not because you needed it, because I wanted to." The distinction sat between them, and she let it sit, and after a while she stopped looking for something to argue against in it. They stayed on the porch until the coffee was gone and the night had gotten its full cold. When they went inside, she paused at the hallway and looked at the closed door, Ruth's room, and then looked at him. "You should open it," she said. "Not today, not on any particular schedule, but it shouldn't stay closed forever." "No," he agreed. "It shouldn't." She nodded and went to her room. He stood in the hallway alone for a moment, one hand resting on the wall beside the door, not touching the latch. Just standing near it. He'd built his life around that closed door for 6 years. He told himself he was preserving something. He understood now, standing in the dark hallway of his own house, that what he'd actually been doing was stopping time, holding still in a moment that had already passed, because forward motion meant accepting that it had. He walked to his own room and lay down on his bed and stared at the ceiling for a while, not sleeping, not exactly awake, just existing in the particular state that comes before a person is ready to change. He thought about Francesca on the porch, saying it felt like something. He thought about Vane's face when he said, "She's my wife." He thought about the way Francesca had looked at him in the hallway earlier, furious and frightened, and something else underneath both of those things, something she hadn't named yet. He thought about what it would mean to open that door. Not just the one in the hallway. The answer, when it came, was quieter than he expected. Not a dramatic shift, not a moment of thunder. Just a man lying in the dark, arriving at something he'd been slowly moving toward for weeks without admitting it. She wasn't Ruth. She wasn't a replacement for anything. She was Francesca Windermere, who scanned horizons and fixed ledgers and held her bag close when she was afraid and had just, on a dark porch under a wide sky, told him that someone standing between her and harm had felt like something. And Everett Cobb, who had asked for a quiet life and a practical woman, understood with the particular clarity that only comes in the dark and the quiet that he had stopped wanting either of those things somewhere around the third day she was here and had just been too stubborn and too careful and too afraid of his own wanting to say so. He didn't sleep for a long time, but when he did, it was the deepest sleep he'd had in 6 years. He opened the door 3 days later. Not with ceremony, not with any particular preparation. He just woke up on a Thursday morning, lay there for about 4 minutes staring at the ceiling, and then got up and walked down the hallway and turned the latch. The room smelled like time. Closed air and old wood and something faint underneath that he couldn't name and didn't try to. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not going in, just letting the light from the hallway fall across the floor the way it hadn't in 6 years. The watercolor was still crooked on the wall. He'd known it would be. He went in, crossed the room, and straightened it. Stood back and looked at it. Still bad, still badly framed. Ruth would have argued with him about moving it at all, would have said the slight angle gave it character, and he would have said that was a generous interpretation of a mistake, and she would have given him the look she gave him when she thought he was being dense about something that should have been obvious. He almost smiled. It came and went quickly, the way those things did, but it had been there. He didn't sort through the boxes. He wasn't ready for that. But he left the door open when he walked back to the kitchen, and it stayed open all day, and he didn't close it that night. Francesca noticed. She didn't say anything, just glanced at the open door once when she passed it in the afternoon, and then looked at him with something in her eyes that wasn't pity and wasn't congratulation, just acknowledgement. You did a hard thing. I see it. Then she went back to what she was doing. He'd learned by now that her silences were not empty. They were full of things she'd decided didn't need saying out loud. The letter she'd been composing for days. He'd seen her at the desk in the evenings, writing and stopping, writing and crossing out, turning the pen over in her fingers the way she did when she was working through something difficult, was finished on a Friday night. She came to him in the main room where he was reading, or pretending to read, a 3-week-old newspaper he'd already been through twice. She sat down across from him and set the folded letter on the table between them. "I want you to read it," she said, "before I send it." He set down the newspaper and picked up the letter. She'd written it in her small, precise hand on the good paper she'd brought in her trunk. The last of it, he suspected, from the careful way she'd used each sheet. He read it slowly. It was addressed to her father. It was not long. It did not beg or apologize or offer justifications for what she'd done. It said, in language that was clear and final and without flourish, that she was married, that she was remaining where she was, that the arrangement he had made on her behalf was not one she had consented to and never would, and that she was asking him, formally, in writing, as a record, to release his claim and cease sending representatives to her home. The last paragraph said, "I am not asking for your blessing, and I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am telling you that my life is mine now. I hope you find a way, in time, to accept that. But I will not wait for your acceptance before I live it." Everett read that last paragraph twice. Then he set the letter down. "It's good," he said. It might make things worse. It might, he agreed. But you'd have written it eventually regardless. She looked at him. How do you know? Because you're the kind of person who needs to say a thing directly, even when saying it quietly would be safer. He pushed the letter back across the table. You've been carrying the unsaid version of this for 2 years. It's done sitting in your chest. She looked at the letter for a moment. My father will read it as a declaration of war. Your father declared war when he arranged your marriage without asking you, Everett said. This is just you letting him know you're aware of it. Something moved across her face. You understand him better than I expected. I understand men who use structure to control things they can't accept losing, he said. Different scale than anything I've dealt with, but the same mechanism. She looked at him steadily. Are you speaking from experience? He thought about the closed door, the 6 years, the account ledger he'd been misreading because he hadn't wanted to look too closely at anything. Somewhat, he said. She picked up the letter, folded it, and held it in both hands. If I send this and he responds by escalating, if he sends someone with more authority than Vane, or involves the county law, then we deal with it, Everett said. The marriage is legal. You're here of your own will. Any law worth the name will recognize that. And the law that isn't worth the name also exists, he said. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. But I'd rather face what's actually coming than keep waiting for a version of it that might be easier to manage. That's not how it works. She was quiet for a moment. You're not afraid. I didn't say that. I'm afraid of a lot of things, he said. I'm afraid Vane comes back with reinforcements. I'm afraid your father finds a judge who owes him something. I'm afraid that everything I've put in place won't be enough. He met her eyes. But I'm more afraid of what this place goes back to if you leave it. She stared at him. He'd said more in that sentence than he'd said about anything personal in probably 3 years, and he could feel the weight of it sitting in the air between them, too real and too exposed to take back even if he'd wanted to. Everett, she said slowly. Send the letter, he said, because he wasn't ready to stand in what he'd just said for very long without somewhere to put his eyes. It needs to go. She looked at him a moment longer, reading him the way she read everything, carefully, completely, without hurry. Then she nodded. I'll take it to town in the morning, she said. To say it. She went alone. He offered to drive her, and she said she'd take the mare, and he recognized it for what it was. A woman who needed to do this particular errand herself, in her own time, without company to manage. He let her go. She was back before noon, the mare's sides damp, her own expression settled into something that looked like the particular calm of a person who has jumped, and is now falling, and has decided to make peace with the falling. It's sent, she said, coming into the kitchen. All right. She poured herself water, drank half of it, set the cup down. Holt Briggs tried to make conversation. He always does. I managed it. She turned around and leaned against the counter. He asked how long we'd been married. What'd you tell him? The truth? That we were married in April and I arrived in May. She paused. He seemed to be calculating something. He's always calculating something, Everett said. He's harmless. He said you seemed different lately. Everett looked up from what he was doing. Different how? He said, and I'm giving you the exact words, less like a man actively trying to disappear. She watched him. I didn't know what to say to that. Neither do I, Everett said honestly. She almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that he could see where it would have been. The change in the house happened in the way most real changes happen. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulated weight of small ones, each individually ignorable, collectively impossible to dismiss. It started with practical things. Francesca had been sleeping in the back bedroom since she arrived, the one he'd cleared out, but the mattress on that bed was old and bad and she'd never complained about it, which meant he'd never thought about it, which was not his best quality. He went to the general store on a Thursday and came back with a new mattress and a look on his face that dared anyone to ask questions about it. She came out to the wagon when she heard him drive up and looked at what he'd brought and then looked at him. The old one wasn't, he started. It was fine, she said. It wasn't fine. It was 12 years old and had a spring situation on the left side that I should have noticed weeks ago. I didn't complain. That's not the same as it being fine, he said. You shouldn't have to complain about a mattress. She stood there looking at him with the afternoon sun behind her, and the expression on her face was the one he'd started privately thinking of as her working something out expression. The one she got when she was receiving information and integrating it into her understanding of how things were. You notice things, she said finally. Not an accusation, just an observation, made with some care. I try to, he said. I'm not always quick about it. She helped him carry the mattress inside without making anything more of the exchange. But later that evening, she brought 2 cups of coffee to the porch without being asked, which she hadn't done since the night after Vane's second visit, and she sat beside him on the steps the same way she had then, close enough that their shoulders were 8 inches apart, and that 8 inches felt very different from the 8 inches that had been between them 3 weeks ago. The following Wednesday, she came to find him in the barn at midday, which she didn't usually do. He was restitching a broken harness, seated on an upturned crate, the leather work spread across his knees. She stood in the barn doorway with the light behind her, and he looked up. I want to talk to you about something, she said. All right. He set the harness down. She came inside, away from the door, and stood with her hands clasped in front of her, a posture he'd never seen on her before. Formal, somehow, like she was presenting something she'd rehearsed. When you told Vane I was your wife, she started, you made a claim that I think we both understand has implications beyond the legal ones. He said nothing. He let her go. And what you said the other night, about what this place goes back to if I leave. She stopped. I've been thinking about that. I figured you had. I don't want to, She paused, choosing the words with the same precision she brought to everything. I'm not going to use your feelings to make myself more secure here. I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking you to make this real because it protects me better. I know you're not. But I am asking you. She stopped again. He could see her working against some deep-rooted instinct that wanted to reframe the question as practical, to give it a safer shape. I'm asking you if you want this to be real, not as a legal strategy, not as a defense against my father. She met his eyes. As a life. The barn was quiet. Outside, a bird called once and stopped. Walker was lying in the sun near the water trough, visible through the open door, uninterested in anything. Everett stood up from the crate. Francesca, he said, I don't do things I don't mean. I know. That's why I'm asking directly. When I told Vane you were my wife, I wasn't running a tactic, he said. I was telling him a fact that I'd decided was true, whether or not the law had caught up to it yet. He stopped, aware that this was more than he usually said in a single stretch, and pressed through it anyway. You walked into this house 5 weeks ago, and you fixed the ledger and cleared the water channel, and you told me the old mattress was fine when it wasn't, and you sat on my porch and said that someone standing between you and harm felt like something. He looked at her, and every one of those things mattered more than I expected it to. She was very still. I'm not saying I've got this figured out, he said. I'm not. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, an uncomfortable gesture she'd seen on him before when language wasn't cooperating. I'm not smooth about any of this. I'm a man who closed a room for 6 years and told himself it was practical. I make errors in the ledger. I leave my boots in the wrong place. You moved the boots, she said quietly. I moved the boots, he said. That's the point. You change things in a person without even... He stopped, tried a different direction. I want this to be real, he said, not because of Vane or your father or the legal paperwork, because I wake up in the morning and I want to know what you think about the fence line, because I come in from the barn and I look for your light in the kitchen before I even realize I'm doing it. He looked at her steadily. That's not a tactic. That's just what's true. She stood there for a long moment in the slant light of the barn, and he watched the careful architecture of her composure do something he hadn't seen it do before. Not break, exactly, but open, like a window being pushed out from the inside. "I don't need you to be smooth about it," she said. Her voice was lower than usual. "I've had enough smooth men trying to manage me. I don't want to be managed." "I know," he said. "I wouldn't know how." "I know you wouldn't." And something in how she said it carried more warmth than anything so far between them. He crossed the barn floor and stopped 2 feet from her and didn't reach for her hand or try to make the moment into something it wasn't ready to be. Just stood there, close, looking at her directly the way she'd looked at him from the very first moment on that dusty road outside the depot. "Partner," he said. Not husband, not protector. Partner. She looked at the word sitting in the air between them, and he could see her turning it over, feeling its weight, finding it accurate. "Partner?" she said back, confirming it. They told Holt Briggs they intended to formalize the ceremony in town, a proper witnessed event recorded at the county office. Not because the paperwork wasn't already done, but because Francesca had said the morning after the barn conversation that she wanted it witnessed, that she wanted people to see the choice being made. "I spent 2 years hiding every decision I made for my father," she said. "I don't want to hide this one." Everett understood. He sent word to Holt, who told Martha Gale, who told the rest of Holt's Crossing with a speed and enthusiasm that suggested the town had been waiting for Everett Cobb to do something of social interest for approximately 6 years. It wasn't elaborate. The county registrar came on a Saturday, a stout woman named Vera Hutchins, who had recorded approximately 40 such ceremonies over 20 years and had the practiced efficiency of someone for whom this was Tuesday. Martha Gale stood as witness. Holt stood as the other, fidgeting with his hat and looking moved in a way he would later deny if asked. Francesca wore the dark blue dress, not the traveling one, but a different one she'd apparently been keeping at the bottom of the trunk. She'd done something with her hair that was different from how she wore it around the ranch, though Everett couldn't have specified what. She looked not beautiful in the way that erases the person, but like herself, clearly and completely herself, which was something better. He wore his best coat, which wasn't saying much. They stood side by side in front of Vera Hutchins in the town hall, which smelled of old wood and the ghost of 100 previous meetings, and they said the words in a straightforward way, without performance. And Vera stamped the paper and handed it to Everett and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Cobb," and shook Francesca's hand and said, "Welcome to Holt's Crossing, Mrs. Cobb." And Francesca looked at the name for a small moment and then looked at Everett, and what passed between them in that look was private and not for anyone else to catalog. Holt shook Everett's hand for too long and got visibly emotional about it, which Everett endured with patience. Martha Gale said, "It's a good thing," to Francesca directly, woman to woman, and Francesca said, "Yes, it is," with a conviction that had nothing performed about it. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the light going long and gold across the grass, Walker running alongside the wagon for the first quarter mile before giving it up and turning back home ahead of them. She was sitting beside him on the bench. Same bench, same road, same 2 people, different than they'd been on every previous drive. "Your father will get word," he said. Not a question. "Yes, Vane will have sent a report by now. He'll know the marriage was witnessed and recorded." She was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't mean he'll stop, but it changes the calculation." "Let him recalculate," Everett said. She leaned slightly, just slightly, a small adjustment of weight, and her shoulder came to rest against his. Not dramatically, just a settling, the way 2 things find their level when they stop holding themselves apart. He didn't move away. They rode the rest of the road home that way, not talking, the land going quiet around them as the sun dropped, and it was the kind of quiet that isn't empty. The kind that's arrived at rather than stumbled into. Earned, maybe, through 5 weeks of hard things said carefully and true things said imperfectly, and doors that had finally, slowly, been opened after years of staying shut. The house came into view around the bend, still weathered, still smaller than the barn, still a building that needed more work than 1 man and 1 woman could reasonably get through in a year. The loose shutter on the south wall was still loose. The kitchen garden that Francesca had started near the east window was coming up in uneven rows because the soil on that side had more rock in it than they'd expected. It was not a perfect place. It had not become one, but the light was on in the kitchen window. She'd left it burning before they went to town, and it fell warm and yellow across the yard, and Everett Cobb looked at it and felt something he hadn't felt about this particular view in a very long time. He felt glad to be coming home to it. He helped her down from the wagon, and this time her hand stayed in his a moment after she was steady on the ground. Not long. Just a moment, the length of a breath, the weight of something decided. Then she went inside to start supper, and he unhitched the horses and put the wagon away in the gathering dark. And the evening went on around the ranch the way evenings did. The ordinary sounds, the cooling air, Walker settling near the back door. And underneath all of it, something that had been rigid and defended in both of them had gone, quietly and without fanfare, into something that might eventually learn to hold more than it ever had before. It wasn't smooth. It would not be. There was still her father, still Vane, still the particular difficulties of two people learning to occupy the same space without losing themselves. There were still mornings when Everett said the wrong thing, and evenings when Francesca went quiet in a way that shut him out, and long stretches of ranch work that left them both too tired and too short for the careful communication that new things required. But they ate supper that night at the same table, and she told him the kitchen garden needed different soil on the east side, and he said he knew a place near the creek where he could dig some out, and they argued briefly about whether it was worth the effort versus just relocating the garden entirely, and neither of them won the argument, which meant they would continue it tomorrow and the day after that. Everett washed the dishes because it was his night for it, and Francesca sat at the desk and made a note in the ledger she'd been keeping, and Walker moved between them with the easy confidence of a dog who had decided long ago that this house was his and was pleased to find it occupied to a degree he could endorse. Before she went to bed, she stopped in the hallway and looked at the open door. Ruth's room, still open, the way it had been for nearly 2 weeks now, the watercolor slightly less crooked on the wall. "I was thinking," she said, without turning around, "we could use that room for something, eventually. When you're ready. Not immediately, but someday." "Yeah," he said. He was leaning in the kitchen doorway, drying his hands on a rag. "I'd been thinking the same thing." She turned and looked at him then, and whatever she saw in his face seemed to satisfy whatever question she'd been quietly holding. "Good night, Everett," she said. "Good night," he said. She went to her room. He stood in the kitchen a while longer, listening to the sounds of the house settle into its nighttime quiet, and thought about the word someday, and how it had once felt like something too far away to be of use, and how, for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, it had started to feel like a direction he was actually moving in. The letter from Philadelphia arrived on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after Francesca had sent hers. She was in the kitchen garden when Everett came back from town with the mail, and he stood on the porch for a moment looking at the envelope before he called to her. Same heavy paper as the first one, same embossed seal. But something was different about it. The handwriting was less precise than before, the letters slightly uneven, like it had been written quickly or under some strain that the sender hadn't fully managed to hide. She came in from the garden with dirt on her hands and looked at the envelope on the table and didn't pick it up right away. She washed her hands at the basin, dried them slowly on the cloth hanging by the window, and then sat down. Everett sat across from her. Same table. Same 2 cups of coffee, going warm between them. She opened it. He watched her read. Her face did less this time. Less of the controlled stillness she used to armor herself. Less of the careful blankness. She just read, her eyes moving down the page, and when she finished, she set it down and sat with it for a moment before she said anything. "He's not sending anyone else," she said. Everett said nothing. He waited. "He says—" She stopped, picked the letter back up, read one section again, set it down. "He says the situation has been made clear to him by his attorneys, that a witnessed and county-recorded marriage under territorial law would be prohibitively difficult to contest without evidence of fraud, which doesn't exist." She paused. "He says that pursuing the matter further would create a public record he has no interest in creating." "That's a practical man arriving at a practical conclusion," Everett said. "It is." Her voice was even, carefully even. "He also says—" A longer pause this time. "He says my mother would have made the same choice." The kitchen went quiet. Everett looked at her. She was looking at the letter, not at him, and her jaw was set in the way it got when she was holding something that had come in harder than she'd expected. Her mother, dead since Francesca was 14. A woman who had spent her life softening a difficult man and teaching her daughter to ride before she was 6, because a woman who can't move under her own power is a woman at someone else's mercy. That might be the most honest thing he's ever put in writing, Francesca said finally. Does it change anything? She thought about it, really thought about it, the way she thought about things that mattered, turning them over, feeling the weight from different angles. No, she said, but it makes him more human than I've let myself think about for 2 years. He's still the man who tried to sell your future to the highest offer, Everett said. Not harshly, just plainly. Yes, she said, he is. Both things are true. She folded the letter and set it aside, not into her apron pocket, not close, just to the edge of the table, where it could sit without demanding anything from her. I'm not going to write back. You don't have to. I know. She picked up her coffee cup. I think the conversation is finished, whatever it was. He nodded slowly. Outside, Walker had started barking at something in the north field, probably a rabbit, probably nothing, and then stopped, apparently deciding it wasn't worth the effort. The morning went on around them, ordinary and unhurried. That's the end of it then, Everett said. That's the end of it, she agreed. They sat with that for a while, not celebrating, not exhaling dramatically, just two people letting a long tension finish its last reverberation and go still. It wasn't a triumphant moment. It was quieter than that, the way most real endings are, less like a door slamming and more like one you realize, after a while, has been gently closed behind you without your noticing exactly when. 3 weeks after the letter, Francesca told him. She'd known for about 10 days before she said anything, which he understood later and didn't hold against her. It was the kind of knowledge that needs to be held privately for a while before it can be handed to someone else. It changes the shape of everything, and a person needs a moment to adjust to the new shape before they can ask another person to adjust to it with them. She told him in the evening, after supper, when they were both on the porch in the arrangement that had become habitual. Him on the upper step, her on the one below, Walker between them, or nearby. The sky doing what the sky did out here at that hour, which was put on a display that neither of them had entirely stopped noticing even after months of living under it. She said, "There's something I need to tell you," and the particular weight of those 6 words made him set down the fence post catalog he'd been looking through and give her his full attention. She told him simply, directly, the way she did everything. No softening, no build-up, just the fact, and then she watched his face. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the yard, at the barn, at the east fence line, at the kitchen garden with its uneven rows and its rocky soil that they'd been working on together for 3 weeks. He looked at all the familiar geography of a place he'd spent 6 years moving through like a man maintaining a property rather than living in one. Then he looked at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. She blinked. It was clearly not the first word she'd expected from him. Yes, I'm well. The early part has been..." She made a small gesture that accounted for the mornings she'd spent being quietly ill in the washroom, which she'd managed to keep mostly to herself, but not entirely, because Everett noticed things now, even when she didn't announce them. "Manageable," she finished. "How long have you known?" 10 days. He nodded. He thought about those 10 days, the way she'd been slightly quieter than usual, the way she'd eaten less at supper and said she wasn't very hungry, the way she'd gone to bed earlier 3 nights running and come out in the mornings looking like she'd been somewhere difficult in her sleep. "You should have told me sooner," he said. "I know why you didn't," he said. I'm saying for next time. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone for 10 days to make sure it's real before you bring it to me." She looked at him. "Next time," she repeated carefully. "Or any time," he said. "That's what I mean." She was quiet for a moment. "You're not..." She stopped. Tried again. "I wasn't sure how you'd..." "Francesca." He waited until she met his eyes. "I said I wanted this to be a life. I meant the whole thing, not the parts that were easy. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the barn that afternoon in the dust and the slant light, when he'd said partner and she'd said it back. That same open quality, that same sense of the careful architecture coming apart at the seams because something true was pushing through it. "I keep expecting you to be less than you are," she said quietly. It wasn't a complaint. It was an admission, honest and slightly raw, the kind that costs something to say out loud. "I've got plenty of room to disappoint you," he said. "Don't worry about that. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean." He looked at the yard again. "I spent 6 years being less than I was, on purpose, because it hurt less, so I understand the expectation." He paused. "But I'm done doing that." She reached over and put her hand on his arm. Not his hand, his arm, just above the elbow, a brief press of her palm. It lasted about 3 seconds, and then she took it back. But it was the first time she'd reached for him without a practical reason to, without the context of a hard day or a frightening moment, just reached. He filed it away without comment, the way he'd been quietly filing away all the small accumulated things, and sat with the particular feeling of a man whose life has just turned a corner he didn't know was coming and finds, on the other side of it, something he hadn't let himself want. He opened the boxes in Ruth's room on a Saturday in September. He did it alone, which felt right, and it took most of the morning. He didn't catalog everything. Some of it he put back, some of it he set aside for decisions he wasn't ready to make. But he found the small journal Ruth had kept the last year of her life, and he sat on the floor with it for a long time, reading parts of it, skipping parts of it, letting himself do the kind of crying that he'd been postponing for 6 years because there had never seemed to be a right time, and he'd confused no right time with no time ever. It was not a clean or dignified process. That was fine. It didn't need to be. Francesca didn't come into the room. She knew he was in there. The house was small, and she would have heard him go in. But she left him to it completely, which was the right thing, and he knew it was the right thing because she understood the difference between alone and abandoned, which was something not everyone knew how to give a person. When he came out in the early afternoon, eyes that were clearly not their normal state, she handed him a cup of coffee without a word and went back to what she was doing, and that was enough. That was exactly enough. Later, he moved the watercolor into the main room. He hung it on the wall near the window, still slightly crooked, and left it that way. Francesca looked at it when she walked through, studied it for a moment, and said, "The perspective is a little off." "I know," he said. "Ruth always said it gave it character." "I think she was right," Francesca said, and went on through. He stood there a moment, alone in the room with the bad watercolor and the afternoon light, and something that had been tight in his chest for a very long time loosened by one more degree. Not all the way. Grief doesn't work like that. It doesn't loosen all the way. It just changes shape over time, gets less sharp, becomes something you carry differently. But it loosened, and he felt it, and he let himself feel it. The ranch changed over the following months in ways that were visible and ways that weren't. The visible ones? Francesca had been right about the soil on the east side of the kitchen garden, and they'd spent 3 weekends digging creek soil and working it in. And by mid-autumn, the garden was producing in ways Everett's land hadn't produced in years. She'd reworked the account system, not just correcting errors, but building a structure that made the numbers readable at a glance, the way a well-organized thing should work. The cattle count, which had been 63 when she arrived, was at 71 by November. Small gain, but the right direction. The room that had been Ruth's was cleaned and aired out. They'd had a quiet conversation about what to use it for, practical and brief, and arrived without drama at the same answer. The ways that weren't visible were harder to name, but more significant. Everett had stopped moving through the ranch like a man doing maintenance on something he was waiting to give up on. He fixed the loose shutter on the south wall. He started a second fence line along the north property boundary that he'd been putting off for 2 years. He drove into Holt's Crossing and sat at Holt Briggs's counter, and actually talked, not just transacted, which was new enough that Holt mentioned it twice. Francesca stopped holding her leather bag close when she was in the house. It sat on the shelf near the door now, accessible if needed, but left alone. He'd noticed the day she'd first left it there and hadn't said a word, just carried the fact of it quietly, the way you carry good news that doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be real. She wrote to Delia Marsh in Philadelphia, her old friend, the one who'd helped her arrange the agency contact, the woman who'd kept her secret and paid whatever social cost came with that loyalty. The letter took her 3 evenings to finish. When it was done, she read it to Everett at the kitchen table, not because she needed his approval, but because she wanted him to know who Delia was, wanted him to understand the shape of the life she'd come from and the people in it worth keeping. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he said, "She sounds like someone worth keeping." "She is," Francesca said. "I was afraid for a long time that writing to her would create a trail. Now there's nothing left to hide from." Delia wrote back within 3 weeks, a long letter that made Francesca laugh twice and look close to crying once. And she folded it carefully and kept it in the desk drawer, rather than burning it the way she'd burned every letter she'd received in the early months here, when leaving no paper trail had been the operational logic of her daily life. The burning of letters instinct was gone now. She didn't need it. That was its own kind of measurement. Silas Vane never came back. Everett had half expected him to, at least once more. A final confirmation visit, a last look at the situation on behalf of his employer. But the weeks passed and then the months, and the good horse with the Philadelphia attack never appeared on the road again. Whitmore Windermere, it seemed, was a man who, when he finally made a decision, made it completely. Everett couldn't decide if that made him worse or slightly more tolerable. He settled on "doesn't matter" and moved on. What mattered was the morning in late October when he was saddling his horse in the barn and Francesca came in wearing her riding coat, her hair pinned up against the wind, and said, "I want to check the north fence line with you today if you're going." "Thought you had the accounts to finish," he said. "I'll finish them tonight. I want to see the north quarter." She paused. "I've been thinking we could move 10 head up that way before winter. The grass is longer up there." He looked at her. She was standing in the barn doorway, practical and direct, talking about cattle management with the easy ownership of someone who had stopped being a visitor without quite announcing the moment she'd made the transition. "That's good thinking," he said. She almost didn't react. But he'd gotten better at reading the small things, and there was a slight shift in her shoulders. Not pride exactly, more like the quiet satisfaction of someone whose competence has been recognized without fanfare, which was the only kind of recognition she'd ever actually wanted. They rode the north quarter together, assessed the grass, agreed on the timing, argued briefly about which 10 head to move, and settled it by each conceding 1 point and holding one, which was how most of their arguments ended these days. On the way back, at the top of the low rise that overlooked the whole spread, the house, the barn, the kitchen garden going dormant for winter, the fence lines running clean and straight in the afternoon light, Francesca stopped her horse and looked at it. He stopped beside her. "I used to have a recurring thought," she said, "when I was in Philadelphia, walking through rooms I was supposed to love, wearing things I was supposed to want, preparing for a life that had been selected for me." She paused. "I used to think, there must be somewhere that's actually mine. Not given to me, not arranged for me. Actually mine because I chose it." He looked at the same view she was looking at, the weathered house that needed more work than it got, the barn that was twice the size of the house, the uneven kitchen garden, the sky going wide and cold above it all. "And?" he said. She looked at him, and the expression on her face was one he didn't have a word for exactly. Not happiness in the simple sense, something more complicated, more earned, the specific feeling of a person who has come through something hard and arrived somewhere real. "And I think I found it," she said. He didn't say anything back. He didn't need to. He just looked at her for a moment and then looked back at the ranch. And they sat there on the rise for a while, the horses patient underneath them, the wind moving through the grass in long silver waves, and let the truth of it be true without dressing it up in anything more. The child was born in the spring, on a Tuesday, which seemed to be the day that things happened in their life. Letters arriving, decisions made, something in the ordinary pattern of a Tuesday apparently hospitable to the significant. It was a difficult birth, long and exhausting, and Everett spent most of it in the next room being completely useless, which was the only role available to him, and the hardest one he'd ever played. Martha Gale had come. Francesca had asked for her specifically, which had surprised Everett until he remembered that Martha Gale's mother had run, and Martha Gale understood something about women who chose their own lives. She was steady throughout, and competent, and she came out twice to tell Everett everything was progressing, and once to tell him to stop wearing a path in the floorboards. He sat down. When it was over and Martha Gale came out the third time and said, "She's well and the baby is well," he stood up and had to put one hand on the wall for a moment just to steady himself, just to let the relief of it settle. He went in. Francesca was exhausted in the specific way that goes beyond tired into something the body has to find its way back from over time. She looked it plainly. Not softened by it, just real, the way she looked at everything, without pretense. But when he came and sat beside her, she turned her head and looked at him with those steady eyes that had read him from the very first moment on the dusty road outside the depot. He looked at what she was holding. Small, red-faced, deeply unimpressed, as far as he could tell, by the experience of arriving in the world. A daughter, Martha Gale had said. They had expected this somehow, the way you sometimes know a thing before you know it. "She looks angry," Everett said. Francesca made a sound that was the closest thing to a genuine laugh he'd heard from her in the last 12 hours. "She has opinions," she said. "She came in with them. Takes after her mother. Let's hope so." Francesca shifted slightly, and the baby turned her face and quieted. "She's going to be difficult," she said, not as a complaint, more as an assessment delivered with something that looked a lot like satisfaction. "Probably," Everett agreed. He put his hand, carefully, with the particular caution of a large man holding something small, over the baby's back. She was warm, impossibly warm, and small, and completely present in the way that new things are present, uncompromised by history or expectation. He sat there for a long time. The light in the room was the soft gray of early morning, the kind that doesn't ask anything of you, just exists and lets you exist alongside it. Outside, the ranch was waking up in its usual way. The horses moving, Walker doing his morning patrol of the property. The birds beginning their business in the oak tree that had stood longer than the house. He thought about a locked room and a bad watercolor, and a woman who stepped off a stagecoach scanning the horizon like someone who already knew what was coming. He thought about a letter requesting a plain, practical woman and what had arrived instead. He thought about Ruth and how grief doesn't close the door on a person's life. It just makes you believe for a while that the door is all there is. "What do you want to name her?" he asked. Francesca considered it with the same deliberate care she brought to things that mattered. "Something she can grow into," she said finally. "Something that gives her room." "Clara," he said. It surprised him. He hadn't planned it. It just arrived, the way true things sometimes do. "My grandmother's name, she was—" He paused. "She was nobody's version of quiet." Francesca looked at him. Then she looked at the baby. "Clara," she said, testing it. The baby, as if responding to the introduction, opened her eyes for the first time and looked at the approximate area of her father's face with an expression that suggested she was reserving judgment but was willing to listen. "Clara," Francesca said again, more certainly this time. "Yes." Deb, there is a particular kind of life that doesn't look like much from the outside. No great drama that resolves cleanly, no moment where all the threads pull together and everything is answered. Just a ranch with a south wall shutter that keeps coming loose no matter how many times it's fixed, a kitchen garden with uneven rows, a dog getting older, a bad watercolor on the wall of the main room, two people who came together sideways and imperfectly and found, in the accumulated weight of shared work and honest words, and the occasional argument that doesn't fully resolve, something they hadn't known they were building until it was mostly built. Everett Cobb, who had asked for quiet and gotten the opposite, understood by his second winter with Francesca that what he'd been protecting with all that silence and all those closed doors hadn't been his peace. It had been his fear. Fear that wanting something again would mean losing it again, and that a second loss would be the one that finished him. He dressed the fear up as practicality, as sense, as the reasonable behavior of a man who had learned from experience. Francesca Windermere, who had run from one life to find another and arrived not knowing what she was arriving into, understood that the hardest thing she'd ever done was not leaving Philadelphia. It was learning to stay. Learning that staying somewhere you've chosen is different from staying somewhere you've been placed, and that the difference requires you to know your own mind clearly enough to trust it, even when trusting it is frightening. They were not perfect people. They did not build a perfect life. There were bad seasons and hard conversations and stretches when the weight of everything felt like more than two people could reasonably hold. Everett was slow to speak and sometimes impossible to reach. Francesca carried a self-sufficiency so deep it occasionally looked like coldness to people who didn't know her, and even sometimes to Everett who did. But they stayed. They kept choosing it. The ranch, the work, each other, in the small, daily ways that don't look like choices because they've become too habitual to require decision. And they raised a daughter who had opinions from the first moment and showed no signs of quieting them, which suited both her parents, who had each learned the hard way that people who don't know their own minds are more easily taken from themselves. The locked room stayed open. The watercolor stayed on the wall, slightly crooked, slightly bad, full of something that mattered. The ranch, which had been a place of maintenance and managed grief, became a home. Not because the right things happened to the right people in the right order, but because two imperfect people, each running from something, each carrying more than they'd admitted, each badly in need of a reason to stop running, found each other at the end of a dusty road in a place that didn't ask for their approval, and decided, quietly and without fanfare, to stay.